Jordan's stand for truth. 9-year-old Jordan Andrews sat quietly in his fourth-grade classroom, focused intently on the math test before him. The classroom was alive with a silent hum of concentration, pencils scratching against paper, occasional sighs breaking through the quiet. His teacher, Mrs. Roberts, watched over the class from her desk, where she flipped through a novel as the students worked. Jordan, with his round glasses perched on his nose, was known as one of the brightest kids in Riverside Elementary. His passion for learning had always been encouraged by his mother, Tasha Andrews, a single parent who had raised him to be inquisitive and fearless. Tasha had always taught Jordan the importance of standing up for the truth, no matter the consequences, a lesson that Jordan had taken to heart. As he scanned question number 14 on his test, Jordan's brow furrowed in confusion. It was a fraction problem that read, if Emma has 3/4 of a cake and gives away 5/3 of what she has, how much cake does Emma have left? Jordan read it again, then once more, his confusion deepening each time. He knew fractions well enough to understand that the question didn't make sense. It was mathematically impossible to give away more than you actually have. Jordan's mind raced as he considered what to do. He knew that the right thing was to speak up. After all, his mom had reminded him just that morning to stand up for what's right, even if it makes you the only voice in the room, as she'd put it. Gathering his courage, Jordan raised his hand, hoping to point out the error to Mrs. Roberts. Mrs. Roberts looked up from her book, a frown settling on her face as she noticed his hand in the air. She was a strict teacher with a reputation for being hard on her students, especially those who questioned her authority. Despite her stern demeanor, Jordan kept his hand raised, his resolve unwavering. "Yes, Jordan," she asked, her tone flat and uninviting. "Mrs. Roberts, I think there's a mistake in question 14, Jordan began, speaking softly so as not to disturb his classmates. "You can't give away 5/3 of 3/4. It doesn't add up correctly." A hush fell over the room as every student turned to look at him. Mrs. Roberts's face tightened, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. She rose from her desk and walked over to Jordan's desk, towering over him with a look of disapproval. "Are you saying I made a mistake, Jordan?" she asked, her voice low but tinged with a cold edge. Jordan hesitated, feeling a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach, but he pushed through his fear. "It's just, mathematically, it doesn't make sense. I thought maybe it should be 2/3 instead of 5/3. Mrs. Roberts' expression darkened, and she glanced around the room, as though ensuring that every student was watching. "I have been teaching for over 20 years, young man," she said acidly, "and I do not make mistakes on my tests. Perhaps the problem is that you don't understand the material as well as you think." A wave of embarrassment washed over Jordan, and he felt his cheeks burn as his classmates continued to stare. Some looked sympathetic, but a few seemed amused, particularly a group of students who often avoided trouble themselves. Despite Mrs. Roberts' harsh words, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that he had done the right thing. "Now," Mrs. Roberts continued, her tone icy, "I want you to stop disrupting this class and get back to your test. I will not tolerate any further interruptions." Jordan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he looked down at his test paper. His heart was racing, and his mind was too jumbled to focus on the remaining questions. He thought about his mother's words, her encouragement to always stand up for what was right, even if it wasn't easy. But now he was questioning if he'd done the right thing. Maybe he should have just kept quiet and answered the question as it was written. The rest of the test period passed in a blur for Jordan. He could hardly concentrate, his mind replaying the interaction with Mrs. Roberts over and over. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the period, he felt a mix of relief and dread. As the other students filed out of the classroom, Mrs. Roberts called out to him, "Jordan, stay behind, please." The pit in his stomach grew as he watched his classmates leave, some casting sympathetic glances his way, while others whispered to each other, occasionally throwing glances back at him. Once they were gone, Mrs. Roberts closed the door, her expression cold and unyielding. Young man, she began, folding her arms across her chest. Your behavior today was completely unacceptable. Challenging my authority in front of the entire class is not something I will tolerate. Jordan's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't mean to challenge you, Mrs. Roberts. I just thought it was a mistake. A mistake. Mrs. Roberts cut him off, her voice rising slightly. This is not the first time you've acted like this, Jordan. You always seem to think you know better than everyone else. That kind of attitude is disruptive and shows a lack of respect for your teachers. Jordan felt a surge of frustration. He hadn't meant to be disrespectful, he was just trying to help. But he could tell from Mrs. Roberts' expression that she had already made up her mind about him. I'm sorry, Mrs. Roberts, he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. But Mrs. Roberts wasn't finished. I'm sending you to the principal's office. Maybe Principal Green can help you understand the importance of respecting authority. Jordan's heart sank. He had never been sent to the principal's office before, and the idea filled him with dread. As he gathered his things and made his way down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being punished for something that wasn't his fault. All he had done was try to point out a mistake. How had things gone so wrong? In the principal's office, he sat in a cold, plastic chair, waiting as Mrs. Roberts spoke in hushed tones with Principal Green behind closed doors. Through the frosted glass, he could see the faint outline of his teacher's figure gesturing animatedly, her words muffled but intense. When they finally called him in, Jordan felt small and vulnerable as he stood before the principal's large desk. Principal Green, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and a stern expression, looked down at him, his face unreadable. Jordan, Principal Green began, his voice calm but firm, Mrs. Roberts has informed me of your behavior in class today. She tells me you were challenging her authority and causing a disruption during an important test. Is that correct? Jordan swallowed hard, trying to find the words to explain himself. I didn't mean to cause a disruption, sir. I just thought the question was wrong, and I wanted to help fix it. Principal Green nodded, but his expression didn't soften. I understand that you may have thought you were helping, but questioning your teacher's judgment in front of the entire class is not appropriate. Respect for authority is essential, Jordan, and it's something we take very seriously at Riverside Elementary. But I wasn't trying to disrespect her. Jordan's voice trailed off as he realized that nothing he said would change their minds. Principal Green sighed, glancing at Mrs. Roberts, who stood with her arms crossed, looking thoroughly vindicated. Jordan, I'm afraid that because of your behavior, we're going to have to suspend you for 2 days. This will give you some time to think about the importance of respect and following instructions. The word suspended felt like a punch to the gut. Jordan's perfect record, his reputation as a good student, all of it felt like it was slipping away. He had never been in trouble before, and now he was being punished for something that didn't even feel like his fault. We'll be calling your mother to come pick you up, Principal Green added, his tone dismissive as he picked up the phone to make the call. As Jordan sat in the office, waiting for his mother, he felt a mix of anger, confusion, and sadness. He had only been trying to do the right thing, but now it felt like he was being punished for standing up for himself. He thought about his mom's words again, stand up for what's right, even if it's hard. But right now, sitting alone and facing suspension, it didn't feel right at all. A mother's resolve. When Tasha Andrews received the call from Riverside Elementary, a familiar sense of anxiety gripped her heart. She knew her son Jordan was a good boy, a thoughtful, respectful child who would never cause trouble for the sake of it. Yet here she was, listening to the school principal explain that her 9-year-old son had been suspended for challenging authority and disrupting the classroom. Disruptive, Jordan? Tasha's voice betrayed her disbelief. Are you sure you have the right child? Principal Green's tone remained steady, as if he had delivered similar news to dozens of parents before her. Mrs. Andrews, I understand this may come as a surprise, but Jordan's behavior today was unacceptable. He questioned his teacher in a way that was not appropriate and disrupted the learning environment for other students. Tasha took a deep breath, her mind racing as she struggled to make sense of what she was hearing. Jordan had always been the kind of child who followed the rules, who treated his teachers with respect, and yet she could hear the certainty in the principal's voice, the judgment that had already been passed. "I'll be there shortly to pick him up," she said finally, her voice clipped with suppressed anger. She didn't want to lose her temper over the phone, but as she hung up, a storm of emotions threatened to break through the calm facade she tried to maintain. On the drive to the school, Tasha's mind replayed the conversation with Principal Green over and over. It didn't make sense. Her son's curiosity and willingness to ask questions were qualities she had always encouraged. She had raised Jordan to think for himself, to value the truth, and to speak up when something wasn't right. And now it seemed that those very qualities were being used against him. When she arrived at the school, she found Jordan waiting for her in the principal's office, his small frame hunched over in the hard plastic chair. He looked up as she entered, and the sight of his tear-streaked face tore at her heart. She knelt down beside him, wrapping her arms around him and pulling him close. "Oh, baby, what happened?" she whispered, brushing a strand of his curly hair away from his forehead. Jordan's voice was barely audible as he recounted the events in Mrs. Roberts' classroom, his words coming out in halting fragments. I just wanted to tell her that the question was wrong," he murmured, his eyes downcast. "But she got so mad, Mom. She said I was disrespecting her." Tasha's jaw tightened as she listened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. She forced herself to remain calm for Jordan's sake, but her mind was already racing, trying to understand how something so small could have escalated into a suspension. When Principal Green appeared in the doorway, Tasha rose to her feet, squaring her shoulders as she faced him. "Mr. Green, I'd like to know exactly why my son is being punished for trying to help." Principal Green's expression was unreadable as he adjusted his glasses and motioned for her to join him in his office. "Mrs. Andrews, please understand that we have policies in place to maintain discipline in our classrooms. Mrs. Roberts informed me that Jordan's behavior was disruptive and undermined her authority. She felt that his actions were inappropriate, and we have to support our teachers in maintaining order." Tasha crossed her arms, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Are you saying that pointing out a mistake is grounds for suspension?" Jordan wasn't trying to undermine anyone's authority, he was trying to help. Isn't that what we want to teach our children? To speak up when something doesn't seem right? Principal Green's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression hardening. "Respect for authority is an essential part of a student's education, Mrs. Andrews, and this isn't the first time Jordan has been outspoken in class. Mrs. Roberts feels that he's shown a pattern of challenging her authority, and we believe it's important to address this behavior before it becomes a larger issue." Tasha felt a surge of indignation. A pattern. Jordan has never been in trouble before. You're talking about a 9-year-old who was simply trying to correct an error. How is that a disciplinary issue? Principal Green's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "I understand this is difficult to hear, Mrs. Andrews, but we have to consider the impact on the classroom as a whole. Mrs. Roberts is an experienced teacher, and she felt that Jordan's actions were disruptive. We trust her judgment." Tasha clenched her fists at her sides, struggling to contain her frustration. She had no doubt that Mrs. Roberts was a capable teacher, but the idea that her son was being labeled as a troublemaker for something so minor felt like a slap in the face. She could sense that there was something more beneath the surface, something unspoken yet pervasive, lurking just out of reach. As she looked into Principal Green's impassive face, Tasha felt a flicker of doubt. Was this really just about a math question? Or was there something deeper at play, something that had nothing to do with Jordan's actions and everything to do with who he was? With a final nod, Principal Green dismissed them, his tone clipped and professional. "I suggest you use this time to speak with Jordan about the importance of respecting authority. We'll expect him back after his suspension." Tasha's anger bubbled up as she led Jordan out of the office, her mind racing with questions and unresolved frustrations. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, that there was something darker, something insidious, lurking beneath the surface. As they walked to the car, Tasha glanced down at her son, her heart aching at the sight of his downcast expression. "Hey," she said softly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You did nothing wrong, Jordan. You understand that, right?" Jordan looked up at her, his eyes wide and searching. "But Mom, they said I was being disrespectful, that I was challenging her." Tasha stopped and knelt down beside him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "You were standing up for the truth, Jordan. Sometimes people don't like to be questioned, especially when they think they're always right. But that doesn't mean you were wrong to speak up. I'm proud of you for doing what you thought was right." Jordan managed a small smile, but Tasha could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the lingering doubt that his actions had somehow been a mistake. As they drove home, she made a silent promise to herself. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. That evening, after Jordan had gone to bed, Tasha sat at the kitchen table, her phone in hand as she scrolled through messages from other parents at Riverside Elementary. She had reached out to a few friends, hoping to understand if this kind of punishment was typical or if there was something more to it. What she discovered only confirmed her suspicions. One parent, a woman named Lisa, had responded with a story that sounded eerily similar to Jordan's experience. Her son, also a black student, had been reprimanded for speaking up in class, labeled as disruptive, and sent to the principal's office. Another parent shared how her daughter had been punished for a minor infraction, while her white classmates had received little more than a warning for the same behavior. As the stories piled up, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that Tasha could no longer ignore. It wasn't just about Jordan. It was about a system that seemed to hold black students to a different standard, a system that punished them more harshly for the same actions. By the time the clock struck midnight, Tasha had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this go. If the school was treating her son unfairly, then she would fight for him. And if this was part of a larger issue, something that affected other children as well, then she would fight for them too. The next morning, Tasha called a meeting with the school board. She spent hours preparing, gathering statements from other parents, researching statistics on racial bias in school disciplinary practices, and compiling everything she would need to make her case. She was determined to confront the school administration head-on and to demand answers for her son and every other child who had been treated unjustly. As she waited for the meeting to begin, Tasha glanced around the room, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and determination. This wasn't just about Jordan anymore. It was about something much bigger, about challenging a system that had allowed bias and injustice to take root in their community. When the school board members finally filed in, she could see the discomfort in their expressions, the way their gazes flickered away from her, as though avoiding an unpleasant truth. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle that lay ahead. Tasha began by recounting Jordan's story, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She spoke about how her son had been punished not for misbehavior, but for daring to question a mistake. She shared the stories of other parents, the evidence she had gathered of a pattern of racial bias in the school's disciplinary practices. The board members shifted uncomfortably as Tasha's words washed over them, her anger and frustration palpable in every syllable. She was unyielding, her voice rising as she demanded accountability and change. "And let me make this clear," she said, her gaze steady as she looked each board member in the eye. "This isn't just about Jordan. This is about every child in this school who has been treated unfairly, every child who has been made to feel like they don't belong simply because of the color of their skin. I'm here to make sure that changes." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions betraying a mixture of discomfort and resignation. They knew they couldn't ignore her any longer. Tasha's voice had sparked something, a ripple of defiance and determination that would not be easily silenced. As she left the meeting, Tasha felt a sense of purpose settle over her. She had taken the first step, but she knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. She would have to fight not just for Jordan, but for every child who had been made to feel less than. But she was ready for the challenge. Because if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was that she would never stop fighting for her son. The rallying cry. The morning after her meeting with the school board, Tasha Andrews awoke with a renewed sense of determination. The weight of the injustice her son had faced, and the implications it held for countless other children, pressed heavily on her mind. She couldn't allow this to be brushed aside as a mere disciplinary issue. This was about something far more pervasive and sinister: the deep-seated biases within the educational system. Jordan was still asleep when Tasha slipped out of bed and made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, staring down at her phone. The meeting with the board had left her both hopeful and angry. While they had listened, shifting uncomfortably as she spoke, they hadn't made any promises. They had nodded, taken notes, and given her vague assurances that they would look into the matter. But Tasha wasn't naive enough to believe that change would come easily. With a deep breath, she opened her phone and began composing a message to a small group of trusted friends, parents she knew from the community who had also expressed concerns about how their children were treated at school. She outlined what had happened to Jordan and asked if they'd be willing to help her organize a community meeting. Within minutes, her phone lit up with replies. "We're with you," one message read. "Let us know what you need." "This has gone on long enough," wrote another parent. "Our kids deserve better." Buoyed by their support, Tasha spent the next few hours coordinating. She booked a space at a local community center and sent out invitations through text, social media, and word of mouth. As the hours passed, the response was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, local activists, people from all over the community wanted to be part of this. By the end of the day, over 100 people had confirmed they would attend. The energy in the room was electric when the meeting finally took place that evening. Rows of chairs filled the small hall, and the buzz of conversations underscored the growing sense of unity and purpose. Tasha stood at the front, her heart pounding as she looked out at the faces before her. She had never been one to lead rallies or make speeches, but the gravity of the situation pushed her beyond her comfort zone. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. "I know many of you are here because you share my concerns about the treatment of our children in this school district." She paused, glancing around the room, letting her words sink in. "Some of you may know that my son Jordan was recently suspended for speaking up about a mistake in his math test. That's it. He pointed out an error, and instead of being listened to, he was punished." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Tasha continued, "But this isn't just about Jordan. Over the past few days, I've heard from so many parents who've shared similar stories. Stories of children who've been disciplined more harshly, treated unfairly, or overlooked. All because they dared to question authority, or simply because they didn't fit a certain mold." A hand shot up in the audience, and Tasha nodded, inviting a woman to speak. "My son was suspended last year for something just as small," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He raised his hand to ask a question in class, and the teacher said he was being disruptive. He's only 8 years old." The crowd murmured in agreement, more voices joining in with their own accounts. A father stood up, recounting how his daughter had been accused of cheating simply because she had scored well on a test. Another mother shared how her son had been sent to the principal's office multiple times for attitude issues, when all he had done was ask questions about the lessons. As each parent shared their story, Tasha felt a sense of solidarity growing among them. This wasn't just a collection of individual incidents, it was a pattern, a systemic problem that had persisted for far too long. "We can't keep letting this happen," Tasha said, her voice gaining strength. "Our children deserve to be treated with respect. They deserve to be heard, not silenced. This is their education, their future, and it's up to us to ensure they have a safe and supportive environment to learn in." The room erupted in applause, and Tasha felt a surge of hope. They were no longer alone. They were a community, bound together by a shared commitment to justice. That evening, the group formed a coalition they called Justice for Our Children. Their mission was clear: to advocate for fair treatment of all students, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, and to demand accountability from the school district. Tasha was nominated as the group's spokesperson, a role she accepted with a mixture of pride and trepidation. In the days that followed, Justice for Our Children quickly gained momentum. They held rallies, gathered signatures for a petition, and reached out to local media. Reporters from the community newspaper were the first to cover the story, followed by larger outlets that picked up on the growing movement. As the news spread, the hashtag Justice for Jordan began to trend on social media, bringing national attention to the situation at Riverside Elementary. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from people across the country, many of whom shared their own experiences with racial bias and unfair treatment in schools. Civil rights organizations took notice, offering guidance and resources to help the group navigate the legal aspects of their fight. Local activists joined forces with Justice for Our Children, lending their voices to the growing chorus of outrage and determination. Tasha found herself thrust into a role she had never anticipated. She gave interviews to reporters, spoke at community events, and even received invitations to speak on radio shows. Through it all, she remained focused on the heart of the issue: her son Jordan, and the countless other children who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect and nurture them. One morning, a few weeks into the movement, Tasha received a call from Marla Johnson, a well-known civil rights attorney who had spent decades fighting for educational equity. Marla's voice was warm and steady, and Tasha could feel the weight of her experience through the phone. "Mrs. Andrews, I've been following your story," Marla said. "I admire the courage you and your community have shown in standing up for your children. I'd like to offer my assistance if you're interested." Tasha felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Johnson. We need all the help we can get." Over the next few days, Marla met with Tasha and the other members of Justice for Our Children, guiding them through the legal process and helping them build a strong case against the school district. They filed formal complaints, requested records of disciplinary actions across the district, and demanded an independent investigation into the practices at Riverside Elementary. With Marla's help, they uncovered a startling pattern of racial disparities in discipline. Black students were suspended at twice the rate of their white peers, often for minor infractions that were overlooked in other students. The evidence was damning, and it added fuel to the fire that was already burning in the community. As the movement grew, the school district became increasingly defensive. Principal Green released a statement claiming that Riverside Elementary upholds the highest standards of fairness and equality for all students. He denied any racial bias in the disciplinary process and insisted that Jordan's suspension had been a necessary measure to maintain order in the classroom. But the community wasn't buying it. Parents continued to rally, gathering outside the school with signs that read, "Let our children learn," and "No justice, no peace." They chanted Jordan's name, demanding that the district acknowledge the issue and take steps to address it. One afternoon, as Tasha stood at the front of a rally, holding a megaphone and looking out at the sea of faces before her, she realized just how far they had come. What had started as a mother's fight for her son had transformed into a movement for justice, one that resonated with people from all walks of life. She raised the megaphone, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed the crowd. "We're here today not just for Jordan, but for every child who has been silenced, every child who has been punished unfairly, every child who has been made to feel like they don't belong. We're here to demand change, and we won't stop until we get it." The crowd roared in response, their voices echoing through the streets, a powerful testament to the strength and resilience of a community united in purpose. As the rally continued, Tasha felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Marla Johnson standing beside her, a proud smile on her face. "You're doing an incredible job, Tasha," Marla said. "This movement has already made a difference, and I have no doubt it will lead to real change." Tasha felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had never asked for this role, had never imagined herself as a leader. But now, standing here with Marla by her side and the community rallying behind her, she knew she couldn't turn back. "We're not just fighting for Jordan," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're fighting for every child who deserves a chance to succeed, no matter where they come from or what they look like. And we're not stopping until we've made this school and this world a better place for them." Marla nodded, her expression sullen. "Then let's keep fighting." As they stood together, watching the crowd chant and wave their signs, Tasha felt a surge of hope. The road ahead would be long, and the obstacles they faced were formidable, but she knew with absolute certainty that they were on the right path. For the first time since Jordan's suspension, she felt a glimmer of optimism. They were making a difference, and no matter what it took, she would see this fight through to the end. The fight for accountability. As the days turned into weeks, the movement for justice at Riverside Elementary gained unstoppable momentum. What had started as a local rally had become a regional story, drawing attention from civil rights organizations, politicians, and education reform advocates. The hashtag Justice for Jordan was now trending nationwide, bringing with it a groundswell of support from people who were tired of seeing children punished for things that had little to do with discipline and everything to do with bias. In the Andrews household, the reality of the situation weighed heavily on both Tasha and Jordan. Tasha was busier than she'd ever been, balancing her responsibilities as a mother, a community leader, and now an unofficial spokesperson for a movement that had grown beyond her wildest expectations. Jordan, for his part, was struggling with the attention. Though proud of what his mother was doing, he missed his normal routine, his friends, his teachers, and the simple pleasure of going to school without the burden of feeling like a symbol in a fight he didn't fully understand. One evening, Tasha sat down with Jordan in their cozy living room. She noticed how quiet he had been, how he seemed to retreat into himself more often than before. She reached out, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jordan," she began softly, "how are you holding up with everything?" He shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know, Mom. It just feels weird. Everyone keeps talking about me, and now people at school treat me differently. Some of them even call me a troublemaker. I didn't mean to start all this." Tasha's heart ached at his words. She pulled him into a hug, holding him close. "Sweetheart, none of this is your fault. You did something brave. You stood up for what was right. What's happening now isn't just about you. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what you did." He looked up at her, his eyes full of uncertainty. "But what if they don't change, Mom? What if all this doesn't make a difference?" Tasha's face softened as she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "Then we'll keep fighting until it does. Real change takes time, but every step we take brings us closer. And remember, you're not alone. We have a whole community standing with us now." Jordan nodded, his resolve strengthening a little, though Tasha could still see the weight of it in his eyes. She knew that he was being asked to bear a burden that no child should have to carry, but she also knew that his courage had sparked something powerful, something that couldn't be extinguished. The following week, Tasha and her allies in Justice for Our Children took their fight to the next level. They called for a formal meeting with the Riverside School Board, backed by mounting evidence of racial disparities in the school's disciplinary practices. Marla Johnson, the civil rights attorney who had taken on their case, had been instrumental in gathering data that painted a clear picture of bias and unequal treatment. The numbers were stark. Black students were nearly 3 times as likely to be suspended as their white peers, often for minor infractions that other students were allowed to get away with. On the day of the meeting, the tension in the air was palpable. Parents, teachers, and students gathered outside the school board's headquarters, their voices carrying through the streets as they held signs demanding justice and accountability. Reporters from local and national media outlets had gathered, their cameras ready to capture the outcome of what had become a high-stakes battle between a determined community and a reluctant school administration. Inside the boardroom, Tasha sat at a long table alongside Marla, and a small group of parents who had come to speak on behalf of justice for our children. Across from them sat the members of the Riverside School Board, along with Principal Green and Mrs. Roberts, the teacher who had initially disciplined Jordan. Their faces were a mixture of defensiveness and discomfort as they glanced at the prepared notes in front of them. Martha began the meeting by presenting their case, her tone measured but firm as she laid out the facts. We are here today to address a systemic issue that has been affecting Black students at Riverside Elementary and throughout this district. The data we've collected shows a clear pattern of racial disparities in discipline, and we are demanding that the school board take immediate action to correct this. One of the board members, a man with thinning grey hair and a tired expression, cleared his throat. Ms. Johnson, we understand your concerns, but I assure you, our policies are designed to treat all students fairly. If there are instances of misconduct, they are addressed according to our guidelines. Marla's gaze was steady. With all due respect, the numbers tell a different story. It's not just a few instances. This is a pattern that has persisted for years. We're not asking for vague promises. We're demanding real, measurable changes. Tasha could feel the tension in the room thickening as Marla spoke. She looked over at Mrs. Roberts, who sat with her arms crossed, her lips pursed tightly. Tasha felt a surge of anger as she thought about how this woman had treated her son, how her refusal to acknowledge a simple mistake had escalated into an ordeal that had upended their lives. After Marla's presentation, Tasha took a deep breath and began her own statement, her voice filled with quiet determination. My son Jordan was suspended for pointing out a mistake on his test, a mistake that anyone could have seen. He wasn't being disrespectful, he was trying to help. But instead of being heard, he was punished. And this isn't just about him. I've spoken with countless parents who have experienced similar treatment. Our children are being punished for speaking up, for thinking for themselves, and we won't stand for it any longer. As she spoke, she could see the school board members exchanging glances, their expressions growing more strained. She could tell that some of them were uncomfortable, but she wasn't going to let them off the hook. We're not here to destroy the school's reputation, Tasha continued. We're here because we want Riverside to be a place where every child feels safe and valued. We're here because we believe that our children deserve an education that empowers them, not one that stifles them. When she finished speaking, the room was silent. Principal Green finally cleared his throat and leaned forward, his face carefully neutral. Mrs. Andrews, I understand your concerns, and I assure you that we take these allegations seriously. However, I also have to consider the need for discipline in our classrooms. Respect for authority is a fundamental part of education, and we cannot allow disruptions to go unchecked. Tasha felt her frustration bubbling over. Respect for authority. My son didn't disrespect anyone. He asked a question. And if that's considered disruptive, then maybe it's time we rethink what we're teaching our children. Another board member, a middle-aged woman with short-cropped hair, interjected. We'll take your concerns into account, Mrs. Andrews, but implementing changes to our policies will take time. We have to consider the broader implications for all students, not just a select group. Marla leaned forward, her voice steely. This isn't about a select group. This is about basic fairness. You've built a system that treats certain children more harshly than others, and that is unacceptable. We're asking for specific actions, mandatory diversity training for all staff, an overhaul of the disciplinary policies to ensure transparency and equity, and an independent review of past disciplinary actions to identify any patterns of bias. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the demands. But Tasha wasn't about to back down. She looked each one of them in the eye, her resolve unshakable. We're not asking, she said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. We're demanding. The board members sat in silence, their expressions a mixture of resentment and resignation. They knew they were cornered, and the weight of public opinion was against them. The meeting ended with no immediate resolutions, but Tasha could tell that they had made an impact. The school board members had been forced to confront the reality of their own failures, and they could no longer ignore the community's call for change. In the days that followed, the fight continued. Justice for Our Children organized town hall meetings, inviting members of the community to share their own stories and discuss ways to move forward. More parents came forward, sharing stories of how their children had been unfairly treated, each one adding fuel to the fire that was now burning across Riverside. The media coverage intensified, with news outlets publishing exposés on the racial disparities in school discipline. Politicians began to take notice, and several local representatives issued statements calling for an investigation into the practices at Riverside Elementary. The pressure was mounting, and the school district was running out of ways to defend itself. One evening, as Tasha was reviewing notes for an upcoming town hall, she received a call from an unexpected source, the superintendent of the Riverside School District. His voice was calm, but Tasha could sense the tension behind it. "Mrs. Andrews," he began, "I'd like to schedule a meeting with you and the leadership of Justice for Our Children. We're prepared to discuss potential changes to our policies, and I believe we can find a way to address your concerns." Tasha felt a surge of triumph, tempered by caution. She knew that this was only the beginning, that the superintendent's offer was likely motivated more by public pressure than genuine remorse. But it was a step in the right direction, a sign that their voices were finally being heard. "Thank you, Superintendent Lee," she replied, keeping her tone measured. "We'll be ready to meet whenever you are. But I want to be clear, we're not settling for half measures. Our children deserve real change, and we're prepared to keep fighting until they get it." The superintendent hesitated, then replied, "Understood, Mrs. Andrews. We'll be in touch soon." As Tasha hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of relief and determination. They had won a small victory, but the real battle was just beginning. She looked at the stack of papers in front of her, filled with testimonies and demands for justice, and knew that there was still much work to be done. That night, as she tucked Jordan into bed, she leaned down and kissed his forehead. "We're going to make this right, Jordan, not just for you, but for every kid who deserves a fair chance." Jordan looked up at her, his eyes shining with pride and gratitude. "Thanks, Mom, for everything." Tasha smiled, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, but also the strength to carry it. They were on the path to change, and no matter how long it took, she was ready to see it through. Negotiations and new challenges. A week after Superintendent Lee reached out, Tasha Andrews and the Justice for Our Children leadership team gathered at the Riverside School District's administrative building. The community had shown unwavering support, and Tasha could feel the strength of their collective resolve as she entered the meeting room, her allies beside her. This was the meeting that would determine the future of the district's policies. It was no longer just about getting Jordan's suspension overturned or proving the injustice of that single incident. It was about establishing long-lasting change to prevent the same from happening to any other child. The room was large and imposing, with a long, polished table in the center. On one side sat Tasha, Marla Johnson, a civil rights attorney, and 3 other parents who had become core members of their movement. On the other side sat Superintendent Lee, several school board members, Principal Green, and a few other administrators. The air was thick with tension, both sides acutely aware of the weight of the meeting. Superintendent Lee opened the discussion with a carefully prepared statement. "First, I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of Justice for Our Children in bringing these concerns to our attention," he began, his tone diplomatic. "We understand that mistakes were made, and we are open to discussing steps we can take to improve our policies." Tasha listened, her expression calm but resolute. She could sense the caution in his words. The administration was acknowledging the problem, but she knew it would take more than polite words to achieve the change they wanted. Marla took the lead, presenting their demands in a clear, systematic way. "We're calling for specific, actionable changes," she began, her voice steady. "First, we need an independent review of past disciplinary actions in the district to identify any patterns of racial bias. Second, we demand that all staff undergo mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training, with a focus on understanding implicit bias and cultural competence. The superintendent nodded, taking notes as Marla spoke, but Tasha couldn't help noticing the flicker of discomfort on Principal Green's face. She knew that he, along with certain board members, likely viewed these demands as excessive or even accusatory. But Tasha was unfazed. This was about holding them accountable. Marla continued, "Third, we're asking for a revision of the district's disciplinary policies to ensure transparency and fairness. This includes creating a clear process for students and parents to appeal disciplinary actions, as well as implementing guidelines that prevent disproportionate punishment for minor infractions." One of the board members, a woman named Miss Carter with short grey hair and a stiff posture, interjected, "We understand these requests, Ms. Johnson, but you must realize that implementing all of this will take time and resources. Our budget is limited, and these changes are extensive." Marla didn't miss a beat. The cost of implementing these changes is far outweighed by the cost of inaction. These students deserve an equitable learning environment, and it's your responsibility to provide that. Tasha watched as Miss Carter shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to argue further. Marla's argument was airtight, and they all knew it. Superintendent Lee cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "We're prepared to move forward on certain items. For instance, we agree that diversity training is important, and we can arrange for workshops for our staff. However, as Ms. Carter mentioned, a full-scale review of past disciplinary actions will take time. We propose a phased approach, where we begin with a pilot program in a few schools to assess the impact before expanding district-wide." Marla's gaze hardened. A pilot program is insufficient. This is a district-wide problem, and it requires a district-wide solution. We have already gathered extensive testimonies and evidence showing that this issue is not isolated to a few schools. If you only address it in part, you're allowing these injustices to continue. Tasha felt a surge of admiration for Marla's tenacity. The attorney was pushing back against every attempt to minimize or delay their demands, and it was clear that the administration was struggling to keep up. Principal Green, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke up, his voice defensive. "Let's not forget that teachers need to maintain order in their classrooms. Discipline is essential for learning, and we can't undermine the authority of educators. If students feel they can challenge every decision a teacher makes, we risk creating chaos." Tasha's patience was wearing thin. She leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "Authority should never come at the expense of fairness. My son wasn't challenging Mrs. Roberts' authority, he was pointing out a mistake, and for that he was punished. Discipline should not be used as a tool to silence students or to teach them that they have no voice." Principal Green met her gaze, but she could see the resistance in his eyes. She knew that his view of authority was deeply ingrained, shaped by years of adherence to a system that saw challenges as threats rather than opportunities for growth. Marla took over again, her tone calm but firm. "We're not asking for classrooms without discipline. We're asking for a system that doesn't unfairly target certain students. Black students in this district are disciplined at a disproportionately higher rate than their white peers, and that is a fact you cannot ignore." The superintendent shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation was going. He glanced around the table, as though looking for an escape route. But there was no escaping the truth. The data, the testimonies, and the community's outrage were all against them. Finally, he sighed, nodding slowly. "We're willing to make adjustments to our policies," he said, his tone reluctant but resigned. "We'll implement a district-wide review and begin the diversity training immediately. And we'll work on creating a clearer process for parents to appeal disciplinary actions. But we'll need time to make these changes effective." Tasha nodded, but she didn't soften. Time is something our children don't have. Every day that goes by is another day they're subjected to unfair treatment. We're willing to work with you, but we expect measurable results, not just promises. The superintendent nodded, his face tight. "Understood, Mrs. Andrews. We'll schedule follow-up meetings to assess our progress." The meeting ended with a sense of cautious optimism. Tasha and her team had achieved a significant victory. They had forced the district to acknowledge the problem and to commit to specific actions. But as they left the boardroom, Tasha knew that this was only the beginning. Implementation would be a long, challenging process, and there would be resistance every step of the way. In the weeks that followed, the district made slow but steady progress. Diversity training sessions began for teachers and administrators, though some of them attended begrudgingly. The disciplinary policy review was launched, with Marla and the Justice for Our Children Coalition keeping a close watch to ensure that the district held up its end of the deal. But as progress continued, so did the pushback. Certain teachers and parents who felt threatened by the changes began to voice their discontent. Anonymous comments on social media accused Justice for Our Children of coddling students and undermining teachers' authority. Rumors circulated that the new policies would lead to classrooms out of control and that the district was being bullied into compliance. One day, as Tasha was leaving a community meeting, she overheard two parents talking in the parking lot, their voices low but clearly agitated. "This whole thing is ridiculous," one of them muttered. "Kids need to learn discipline, not be given a free pass. If they can't handle a little authority, what's going to happen when they get out into the real world?" "Exactly," the other parent replied. "And all this fuss over one kid getting in trouble. I mean, maybe he was out of line. We don't know what really happened in that classroom." Tasha felt a pang of frustration, but she reminded herself that change was rarely easy. She knew that for every person who resisted, there were dozens more who supported their cause. But the opposition was growing, and Tasha could sense that the district was feeling the pressure. Later that week, Superintendent Lee called a private meeting with Tasha and Marla. His tone was cautious, even apologetic, as he explained the situation. "There's been some backlash," he admitted, his hands folded on the table. "Certain teachers and parents feel that these changes are undermining their authority. They're concerned about the impact on discipline in the schools." Marla's expression was unyielding. "Change is uncomfortable, Superintendent, but it's necessary." These concerns are rooted in fear, not fact. If the district stands by these reforms, they'll eventually see the positive impact on both students and teachers. Tasha leaned forward, her eyes locked on the superintendent's. "Our children's right to fair treatment is not up for debate. We will not allow this to be watered down just because a few people are uncomfortable." The superintendent nodded, though Tasha could see the fatigue in his eyes. She knew he was caught between the demands of the community and the resistance from within his own staff, but she refused to back down. They had come too far to let fear dictate their progress. As the months passed, the reforms began to take root. The diversity training sessions sparked difficult but necessary conversations among teachers and staff, forcing them to confront their own biases and assumptions. The review of disciplinary actions revealed troubling patterns, which led to a formal apology from the district and a commitment to changing their approach. But the victory was bittersweet. The resistance had left a mark, creating a divide within the community that was slow to heal. Some teachers who had been openly supportive of justice for our children faced criticism from their colleagues, while certain parents withdrew their support out of fear of backlash. Despite the challenges, Tasha remained steadfast. She continued to speak at community events, to organize rallies, and to advocate for the rights of every child in the district. She knew that change was a long, arduous journey, one that required resilience and unwavering commitment. One evening, as Tasha was preparing dinner, Jordan came into the kitchen. He looked up at her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "Mom," he asked, "why do you keep fighting? Even when people are being mean and saying we should stop?" Tasha smiled, her heart swelling with pride and love. She knelt down beside him, looking into his eyes. "Because, Jordan, this is about more than just you or me. It's about making sure that every child has a chance to succeed, to be treated with fairness and respect. Sometimes, standing up for what's right means facing challenges, but if we don't keep fighting, who will?" Jordan nodded, his eyes shining with understanding. He hugged her tightly, and in that moment, Tasha knew that all the hardships, all the late nights and difficult conversations had been worth it. She was teaching her son not just to stand up for himself, but to stand up for others, to be a force for good in a world that often resisted change. As the months turned into years, Riverside Elementary became a symbol of transformation, a place where students of all backgrounds were given the support and respect they deserved. The journey had been long and difficult, but Tasha knew that they had made a difference. Justice for Our Children continued to advocate for change, not only in Riverside, but in schools across the state, inspiring other communities to take a stand. And through it all, Tasha held on to the knowledge that they had made the world a little bit better, a little bit fairer for the next generation. Legacy of change. Years passed, but the ripple effects of Tasha Andrews' fight for justice at Riverside Elementary remained powerful and transformative. The reforms Justice for Our Children had fought so hard for continued to shape the district, gradually building a culture of equity and fairness that had once seemed unattainable. Jordan was now in high school, a confident young man with a quiet strength and an unshakable moral compass. His experience at Riverside had marked him deeply, but instead of leaving scars, it had built a foundation of resilience and empathy. The child who had once been punished for speaking up was now a young leader, respected by his peers for his wisdom and compassion. One day, as Tasha was organizing files for an upcoming community meeting, Jordan joined her in the living room, watching her with a contemplative expression. He was now tall, his broad shoulders a reminder of how much he'd grown since that day in 4th grade, when he first pointed out the error on his test. Tasha still saw glimpses of that 9-year-old boy in his eyes, but there was also a maturity there that humbled her. "Mom," he began, sitting down beside her, "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me back then. I don't think I really understood it at the time, but now I get it. You weren't just fighting for me, you were fighting for everyone." Tasha paused, her hands resting on the stack of papers in her lap. She smiled softly, pride swelling in her chest. "Yes, sweetheart. It started with you, but it became so much bigger. It was about making sure that every child, no matter who they are or where they come from, has a chance to be heard and treated with respect." Jordan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's strange. Back then, I just wanted everything to go back to normal. I didn't want all the attention. But now, I'm glad it happened. I'm glad you didn't give up, even when it was hard." Tasha reached over and squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth and strength in his grip. "You were my inspiration, Jordan. Watching you go through that experience, seeing how brave you were to stand up for yourself, even when it cost you, gave me the strength to keep going. I knew that if I could help even one child avoid that kind of pain, it would be worth it." Jordan glanced down at the papers she was organizing, his eyes scanning the titles, reports, data, meeting notes, all part of the ongoing work of Justice for Our Children. Though the initial fight with Riverside Elementary had ended years ago, Tasha had never stopped advocating for equity in education. The coalition she had helped build had grown, expanding beyond Riverside to influence policies across the entire state. Parents, teachers, and community leaders from all over had joined the movement, turning Justice for Our Children into a statewide force for educational reform. "Are these for the meeting next week?" Jordan asked, nodding toward the files. Tasha nodded. "Yes, we're meeting with the State Education Board. They're considering a proposal to mandate anti-bias training in every district, not just ours. We want to make sure they understand how important this is." Jordan's face lit up with admiration. "You're still fighting." Tasha laughed softly. "It's become a part of who I am, I suppose. Once you see how deeply these biases run, how much harm they cause, it's hard to look away. There's always more to do." He looked at her with newfound respect. "Mom, I think I want to help. Not just now, but I want to be a part of this, like you are. I don't want other kids to go through what I did. Maybe I could come with you to the meeting." Tasha felt her heart swell with emotion. She had always hoped that Jordan would carry forward the values she had instilled in him, but hearing him express a desire to continue the work she had started filled her with profound gratitude. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'd love for you to be there. It's your story that inspired all of this. Your voice has always been at the heart of our movement." At the meeting with the State Education Board, Jordan sat beside his mother, watching her speak with authority and conviction. She outlined the progress they had made, the policies they had implemented, and the data that showed the positive impact of these changes on students. When she finished, she turned to Jordan, giving him an encouraging nod. Jordan took a deep breath, steadying himself before he spoke. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members, many of whom were older men and women who had been in the field of education for decades. He knew that his words would carry weight because of his own experience, but he also felt the responsibility of speaking on behalf of all the children who couldn't be there to share their stories. "When I was 9, he began, his voice clear and steady, "I was suspended from school because I pointed out a mistake on a test. It sounds small, but it changed my life. At the time, I didn't understand why it happened. I thought I had done something wrong. But looking back, I see that it wasn't about me. It was about a system that wasn't built to listen to kids like me." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye on him, every ear attentive. "My mom stood up for me when no one else would. She taught me that it's okay to speak up when something is wrong, even if it's hard, even if it feels scary. But not every kid has a parent like my mom. Not every kid has someone fighting for them. That's why we need policies that protect kids from being punished unfairly. That's why we need anti-bias training, so teachers and administrators can see us for who we are, not for the color of our skin or the stereotypes that others place on us." One of the board members, a woman with glasses and a warm smile, leaned forward. "Thank you, Jordan, for sharing your story. It's clear that you and your mother have made a tremendous impact in your community. We'll take your experiences into account as we review the proposal." As the meeting adjourned, several members of the board approached Tasha and Jordan to thank them personally, expressing their admiration for their courage and commitment. Tasha could see the genuine respect in their eyes, and she felt a sense of accomplishment that was deeper than any individual victory. Later, as they drove home, Jordan turned to his mother, his face filled with excitement. "That felt amazing, Mom. Like I was finally able to turn what happened to me into something good." Tasha smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "You did more than that, Jordan. You showed them that our voices matter, that every child's voice matters. What you did today will help other kids feel like they're not alone, like they can stand up for themselves too." In the years that followed, Justice for Our Children continued to grow, establishing chapters in communities across the state. The organization offered workshops, resources, and advocacy for parents and students, helping them navigate the educational system and ensuring that every child had access to a fair and supportive learning environment. Tasha remained at the helm of the movement, her influence spreading as she spoke at conferences, appeared on panels, and collaborated with other organizations fighting for educational equity. Her work was tireless, but it was also deeply fulfilling, fueled by the knowledge that she was making a tangible difference. Jordan graduated from high school with honors and went on to study sociology and education policy in college. Inspired by his mother's work and his own experiences, he dedicated himself to understanding the systemic issues that affected marginalized students. He wanted to become an advocate for change, to help shape policies that would ensure fairness and equity for all children. By the time he graduated, Jordan had become a respected voice in the movement for educational reform. He joined Justice for Our Children as a full-time advocate, working alongside his mother and the coalition she had built. Together, they traveled the country, sharing their story, meeting with legislators, and pushing for reforms that would create a more just educational system. One day, as they were preparing for a speaking engagement, Jordan turned to his mother, a look of deep gratitude in his eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "none of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up for me all those years ago. You showed me what it means to fight for what's right, You gave me the courage to be who I am." Tasha felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she looked at her son, now a young man who had taken her fight and made it his own. "Jordan, you were always my inspiration. Watching you grow into the person you are today has been the greatest reward of my life. I'm so proud of you." They embraced, a mother and son bound not only by love, but by a shared purpose that had transcended a single incident and become a legacy of change. They knew that their work was far from over, that there were still countless children who needed their voices amplified and their rights defended. But they were ready for the journey, armed with the knowledge that one act of courage, one voice raised in defiance, could spark a movement that would change the world. And as they stepped onto the stage to share their story once more, they felt the weight of that legacy, the legacy of resilience, justice, and an unbreakable bond between a mother and her son, guiding them forward, lighting the path for future generations.